Very good point. And I just want to talk a little bit more about how you've incorporated these in-depth personality profiles into developing a team, because on the one hand, you want people, as you just suggested, for a certain role who have the qualities needed to succeed as a recruiter, but then you also have an office and environment, and you want to make sure that people fit in. And so you have, I know, a very clear sense of what you want your office environment to be like and the kind of individuals who will fit into it. Can you share with us what you've tried to create as a team, and then how you can tell whether or not someone will in fact fit in?
Yes, I think one thing that's been really helpful particularly was our Caliper consultant. We've had more than one consultant, but they've always been so well trained and desiring to understand not just our role, and I think that that's critically important, not just whether it's the role of it being a salesperson or a recruiter, but what we look for in our culture, what's important to us, and getting to know our people so that when we're bringing someone on board, they're factoring in a lot of variables, the team themselves, what their personalities are like, the industry that they're serving, which all come into play. So there have been several times where we've looked at a candidate and said, which of these teams would they work best with? Where would they mesh the best? What about the industry they're serving? Because there are different nuances to each of those, and I think people forget those things.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the team that you've developed at OM5, what qualities do you look for in an individual you want to bring on, regardless of what position they're in?
Well, I think it's interesting. Over time, that has shifted. There's things that I've learned about the profile, and some of them go back to what I learned in the beginning. I do think that if they're in any position related to sales or recruiting, they should have ego drive. But I've also used Caliper in terms of hiring administrative assistants and even our receptionist, because there were certain traits depending on where they sat in the office, how much supervision, how much time did we have to spend with those people. So we wanted to know whether it was their abstract reasoning, their creativity, their assertiveness, to be able to speak up maybe if they were at the front desk as a receptionist. But empathy always comes into play. I've continuously found that the higher the ego drive and the empathy, the better result that we had, truly. We've hired people that were the opposite, but have found if you can get people high in both, that's outstanding, as long as they do have some urgency. Personally, I like people with very high urgency and self-structure, just because I found that they are very self-motivated, and it also helps me as a manager know how much time and attention I need to give to them, the ones who are better at self-management than others who might need a little more time and attention and checking in with them. That helps in terms of structuring your day and knowing, again, who to pair with whom in order to have successful teams. And again, I think in times like today, when every dollar is so precious, people forget. They tend to think, well, I can hire on my own and not pay a fee for recruiting, or I can hire on my own and not use a profile. And yet I think that that would be a horrible mistake, because I think right now, because it is so precious, you really, truly need to have all the right people in the right seats on the bus. As I used the profile over time, I found that there were certain traits that became more important. I discovered very subtle nuances, and the accommodation and the flexibility scores I discovered to be like a second tier. If the accommodation was extremely high or extremely low, to either degree on the spectrum, that became a challenge. Particularly if the accommodation was too high in selling, we found that they couldn't close, they weren't as good a negotiator. They could do very, very well for us, and in fact, one of our top performers, but we had to learn how to give her a little extra support, because she did tend to say yes to anything. So we tried to help her, and sometimes we would have someone, again, go on a sales call with her or be there to help coach her and say, did you think about this, or why don't you say this? Just sometimes to make sure that there was consistency in the organization. So having too high and then, again, having too low. Sometimes if the accommodation was so extremely low, those people would tend to come across not as good of a team player. You needed sometimes to have the people on the team be a little more resilient so they didn't take things personally. Flexibility-wise, that became a real critical factor, because I found that the lower the accommodation and flexibility, the more difficult it is to put people on a team with those individuals. Or sometimes you would have client issues. They could be extremely good at the job, but you had to learn to work around those little traits. So it's those things that you find after you've used the tool for 8 years, as I have, that you start wondering how people hire without it.
Very interesting, Glenda. Let's switch gears now, because I know a lot of recruiting firms have incorporated Caliper's approach to hiring and developing top performers into their own company. So when they're hiring for themselves, they use our approach. But often there's a hesitancy to use it for the individuals that they're recommending to their own clients. How have you worked in that area?
I believe very strongly in doing that. Some clients are not as flexible in adapting to it because they want the process to move quickly, and I have to coach them on the fact that it may take them a few more interviews to find the right person. However, I think that in the long run, I found that once they try it and they see the result in terms of the person that's been with them and the difference in that hire, they become very excited about it. Each client adapts differently to it because it depends on their belief in their interview skills and things like that. But we recently had a situation where it was an accounting position, and the company was just very concerned. Ironically, they had 3 candidates, and they were just having a very difficult time deciding between them. So we decided to use the Caliper with 2 candidates, and because of the feedback and because of the different nuances subtly in the personalities, they decided to hire both candidates. And 90 days later, I believe it is, they are extremely happy, and they said that they would never hire again without the profile. So it actually turned into 2 positions being filled rather than 1.
Wow. Wow. And so basically you view this then as an added value, as something to help clarify and make sure that you are in fact recommending the very best individuals to your clients.
Yes, and I've had situations, for example, we have done administrative placement, and I've had clients where they said that in 20 years of hiring, they had never had an administrative assistant that they liked working with, which I found very hard to believe, and I immediately felt like we needed to change that. And so I asked that client if he would be willing to consider doing a profile himself so that we could match his assistant best to his personality, which he did. And we found an assistant for him that he's been extremely happy with. But those stories where they kind of resign themselves to the fact that, oh, well, I guess my personality is so different from someone in an administrative role, I'll just never like working with those people. And that's not necessarily true. So sometimes we've used it to make the experience better. Sometimes it's to differentiate between a candidate, particularly if I have a client, obviously, in sales, but I've used it just as much for administrative, accounting, or executive level positions, and specifically in a leadership role.
That's so interesting. I want to come back to the leadership role in just a minute, but can you tell us, what did you find out about him that you were able to match him to someone who could work effectively with him? That's like a brick wall you were running up against. Exactly.
And interestingly, he had just accepted that he wouldn't find what he was looking for,
right.
Because he just didn't know how to go about doing so. He was a typical hard-driving personality in a field that required such, and because his urgency was so strong and his confidence was so strong and his intellect so strong, you know, here was a bright, capable, determined, aggressive, competitive person who needed someone with the intellect and the resilience to keep up with him, needed the detail orientation and organizational skills to keep everything in order for him, but someone who did not have a certain level of abstract reasoning, was not resilient and confident enough and urgent enough to keep up with him, only frustrated him.
Right.
And then in turn frustrated his assistant as well. We also looked for empathy. Someone with the ability to put themselves in his shoes, understand this is a person with a lot of stress, a lot of pressure, has to make crucial decisions, has to make them quickly, needs the information in a split second. Their goal became to be the caretaker, to keep up with him, to have it ready, to anticipate his needs, so that in the process we weeded out a lot of people very early on in the process. And we did have to interview more candidates in order to get there, but we wound up with the right match.
I know in some cases, you know, they say opposites attract, but here what you've done, as I've heard, is you found someone who has a lot of similar qualities as that executive, so that they had a lot in common and yet were built in such a way that they wanted to be there to help someone else succeed.
Right. That's absolutely right.
Interesting. That's a great way of sharing how this can work. You talked about finding leaders for other companies. That's certainly very challenging, particularly in today's day and age when companies are up against such troubled times. And often, even in the easiest times, it can be difficult to bring in a new leader into an organization. They often don't last more than 2 years because something doesn't happen either in terms of the chemistry or the way they're trying to get things done that doesn't work with the organization. How do you find a new leader for an organization?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think what has fascinated me, that I had a challenge in my own office, and we discovered within the network offices, I would go to board group meetings where other owners would be in a room, and we would talk about the challenge of not just bringing on people in a sales or recruiting role, but how do we grow our teams? How do we find someone who will take charge and who wanted to be a leader? And what I discovered was I had become very highly skilled at identifying top performers. However, I forgot about who's going to lead them and how do I grow my organization and find people who want to be leaders. And what we discovered was there's always the ongoing discussion of whether leadership is nature or is it nurture? Is it something inborn? And I think a lot of people tend to feel that everyone has the ability, given some training, to step up and be a leader, or most people do. And I think what I found is there are certain skill sets and traits that are most important and can truly hinder someone that they may never have the ability to be a leader, no matter how much we would like them to. The typical role is we promote people out of the role they're most effective in. They become a top performer, and so because they're a top performer, well, they might be the best person to lead a group, and that's not necessarily true. So I think in a leadership role coming in from the outside, having certain skill sets, for example, assertiveness, the ability to speak clearly and directly and communicate with empathy and compassion. If they're walking into an organization, they need to be a good listener first, ideally, and be able to empathize with the organization, where they are, where they've been, where they want to go. They also need to have a desire to see results. They need to have some resilience, or at least the ability to execute, meet deadlines, but work with the people, see the big picture problem, and bring the result to fruition for the organization.
Well, thank you so much, Glenda. It's been great talking with you. You have such clarity about what you're looking for, both inside of your own organization as well as for your clients, and so it's very, very, very refreshing, and it's also just a lot of fun to work with someone who's so knowledgeable.
Well, thank you. I have to say I've learned a lot about people. It's helped me, I think, be a better recruiter and hopefully a better person and a better manager. It's helped me understand other people better.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patrick.
So, Cindy, I heard Glenda talking a lot about how using assessments add real depth to her process. And she said that with some clients, she has to coach them to understand that finding the right match might take a bit more time than they would initially anticipate. How do you think this affects the relationship between the applicant who is searching for a position and the company, which is the client of the recruiting firm?
Patrick, it gives the recruiter an opportunity to really position themselves as full business partners with their clients, because now the recruiting firm has the best interests of the client at heart and is representing those by presenting not just the best qualified candidate, but the one that is best suited for the role based on personality. And in fact, that is likely to have a positive impact on long-term employee retention, job performance, and job satisfaction. So the recruiter is bringing an added value and is actually strengthening the relationship between itself and the client.
That's so interesting, because particularly with jobs like you're talking about in terms of executive jobs, leadership jobs, management, sales jobs, and professional level positions, I know an enormous amount of how well we succeed has to do not just with what we know, but who we are and how we come across.
That's right, Patrick. And when we are well suited to the position, both our job performance and our job satisfaction increase. So the employer of choice becomes one that can offer a position to the employee for which they're well suited.
Interesting. I'd like to explore that idea further.